Julia, in trying to discern consciousness, one of the key fundamental questions that distinguishes different theories is whether it can be explained in terms of physical, material reality. So, from your research, from your ways of thinking, from neuroscience, how do you deal with that question? Is consciousness entirely physical? We obviously know it's physical in many, many respects, but is it entirely physical?
Oh no, I have to disagree. I'm not sure it's physical at all. So what I mean is that I think actually we've been hoodwinked for hundreds of years to reverse what we know. So if we're really going to be empirical about what we can actually know about the outside world, the physical world, we better at least first say that the only thing that we are aware of, that we can know, is what we experience. That's all we got.
Sure.
That's it. So first, consciousness, right? Then we have to start asking questions like, is this real? Is this real? Was this real? Right? Is the physical world real? How much of the physical world can be explained as a mechanism that's produced by consciousness? That's to me the more rigorous, scientifically, empirically motivated question. But we've been turned around to learn that, well, we can't be sure about this thing that we have called consciousness, but we know that this is here. We know this chair is here. Right. For sure the chair is there. Right. But this consciousness thing, who knows? Right. It's completely backwards in terms of the actual amount of information we have, right? The actual information that we have, really, fundamental piece of information we have is that consciousness exists. Everything else is extrapolated.
Well, that I have an inner experience, but...
Yeah, that's the only piece of information we really have. Everything is extrapolated from that.
Okay.
Right? So it's a backwards question. So that's where I sit on it. I am feeling like this whole how do we explain, how much of consciousness can we explain with the physical world is bizarre. It's a bizarre question.
Well, as a neuroscientist, you know for sure that virtually, or if not all, the content of consciousness is physical. You have a tumor in your auditory part of the cerebral cortex, you won't be able to hear anymore. Well, you have a stroke in your language, you won't be able to speak in very fine gradation. Sometimes you can read but can't speak. Sometimes you can speak and not read because of different
wait. That's not the same thing as saying that consciousness is physical. That's saying that things in the brain affect our consciousness, for sure.
As I said, the content of consciousness.
But that doesn't mean the content of consciousness is physical. It means that there's correlations between things that are going on in our brain and consciousness, of course.
So can you have a content of consciousness such as language or seeing things without a brain, or with the parts of the brain that are not functioning?
I don't know. But I know that we can't claim that consciousness has to be created of physicality, that physicality is somehow primary and we have to get consciousness out of it, because that is backwards. Because the only thing we can for sure know, if we're going to be incredibly rigorous about what we know about the external world, the only thing we can be sure of is consciousness, so that has to be the thing out of which we try to understand everything. So it's like saying the chair that we're not sure it exists has to explain everything, right?
Okay.
Right.
Right. So there are most people in neuroscience would think that as neuroscience continues to progress, and you're in neuroscience, I've been in neuroscience, so we know the progress of the field, that ultimately it will be able to explain all things in consciousness. So even if I would agree with you, which I don't, but even if I would, that we have to assume consciousness is the only thing first. If then you use consciousness and discover that all of the aspects of consciousness, all of its content, and even its phenomenology, if that's possible, to be explained by somehow some mechanisms in the brain for the content and some new brain ways of doing it, there are theories around that could explain the phenomenology. If that occurs, if that process occurs, would you then say that consciousness is entirely material? Even though you started by saying consciousness is the only thing I recognize, then you study the materiality and you recognize that everything in consciousness can be explained by the materiality. Would that make you change your view?
I think I would end up agreeing with that statement, assuming that we acknowledge that materiality is a product of consciousness. So it is a thing that we receive information about via consciousness. So yes, I mean, so I think that neuroscientists can maybe eventually make that connection, and maybe I'll be one of the people that helps to do that, and that would be very exciting. And I don't think I would ever say that that means that consciousness is physical or material. I think what will happen is if we ever bridge this gap, it will be bridged by understanding that material is consciousness from the other direction.
From the direction of consciousness?
Yes. So
But I'm saying that if you could show that all the elements of consciousness can be explained by neurophysiological, neuropsychological processes,
Yeah.
and there's no residue in consciousness, nothing left, that I'm not saying this is easy to do or will ever be done.
I understand.
I'm saying if
Yeah.
it can be done,
Yeah.
and that you can explain it,
Yeah.
would you then say that consciousness is entirely material, even though you had to enter the process through consciousness, because that's our only access?
Yes, and I would, and then I would define material as that thing that we call material that is created out of consciousness. In other words, I would...
But you have no justification. What's your justification for that at that point?
At that point?
Yeah, because
you're using the word explain to say that we have all the pieces and then we're going to show how everything works, right?
Yeah.
That's your explanation. So to me, all I would do is say all that stuff is happening,
Right.
and all of that is a product of consciousness. You see? So that explanation is there. And
But the explanation now has been proven neuroscientifically because you've been part of it and you had your research, everybody,
Yeah.
and thousands of people for
Yeah.
hundreds of years,
Yeah.
however long it takes, and now that's done.
Yeah.
But when you make that final step, say, okay, now it's all in consciousness, that's just a statement. There's there'd be no science behind that, nothing behind that. Just a.
well, no, but it's our conscious experience that everything.
It's a conscious experience.
Which is all we have. So that always has to be there, no matter how far you get with understanding how the brain relates to consciousness.
Admittedly, that it's always part of our consciousness. But even though it's now been explained, so I mean,
But see, your word for explain is different. Probably when you say explain, I think what you mean is now that we've decided that consciousness is made out of material, right?
Right.
And what I hold is that we will never, because consciousness is primary, we will never explain, if that's what you mean by explain, consciousness that way. The only way we will get to a place where people understand the relationship between brain and consciousness is when we acknowledge consciousness as primary, because it demonstrably is, right? The most rigorous scientific test is just to ask, really, what information do I have about the universe? All I have is that I'm conscious. That's all I have. Everything else, I'm inferring, right? So that will always be there. So we have to explain that. So to me, that's what the explanation has to come from, start with consciousness. You can't go the other direction because that doesn't explain the first.
Okay. Does any of the research that you do on anomalous sensations that some people call extrasensory perception that you believe is real, if that is real, would that be part of an argument that you would give that consciousness has some independence and is not material?
My work, I feel, would not suggest that. My work is tied well within physiology and well within physics.
As long as you have some kind of backward causation over time.
As long as there's some kind of ability to solve those equations backwards, which for most laws of physics, most classical laws of physics, you can solve those equations backwards. And the second law of thermodynamics, which does have an arrow of time, doesn't apply to open systems, which we are. So my work, no.
But your claim is that consciousness, because it's our only access to the world, will always be primary no matter what happens in the discoveries in the physical world or about the physical brain.
It's not even a claim, it seems self-evident. It seems if you're going to stick with what you can really know, that's all you can really know. So any explanation of consciousness better explain that, better explain how it's fundamental. And any explanation of consciousness that doesn't fails.